I'm Sarah Mitchell, and the proudest day of my life became the most devastating in a matter of seconds. Standing there in my cap and gown, psychology degree in hand, summa cum laude honors around my neck, I thought I was finally going to hear those words I'd been chasing my entire life. Instead, my father looked me dead in the eye in front of my entire family and said, "You think you're better than us now? You're dead to me." 3 months later, while cleaning out my grandmother's attic, I found a handwritten will that revealed why he never truly felt like my father, because he wasn't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins long before that graduation day disaster, back when I was just a kid growing up in Cedar Falls, Oregon, dreaming of something bigger than our little town could offer. Cedar Falls is one of those places where everyone knows everyone's business, where your family name carries weight, and where leaving for college is seen as either a necessity or a betrayal, depending on who you ask. Population 45,000, home to a decent university, surrounded by mountains that make you feel both protected and trapped at the same time. The Mitchell house sits on Maple Street in a neighborhood where all the houses look basically the same, built in the 70s with that brown and orange color scheme that screams Middle America. My dad, Robert Mitchell, has worked maintenance at Oregon State Hospital for as long as I can remember. He's the kind of man who fixes everything with duct tape and determination, who believes that hard work is the only currency that matters, and who views education beyond high school as something for people who think they're too good for honest labor. My mom, Linda, works at Cedar Falls Community Bank as a teller, the same job she's held since I was in elementary school. She's got this way of making everyone feel welcome, always has fresh cookies for neighbors, and remembers every customer's kid's name. But there's something else about her, something I couldn't quite name growing up, a sadness that would creep into her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Especially when my dad would go off on one of his rants about college-educated people thinking they're superior. Then there's my younger brother Jake, who inherited Dad's mechanical genius and could rebuild a car engine before he could legally drive. Jake never questioned the family dynamics, never pushed against the boundaries, never made waves. He was Dad's golden child, the son who understood that Mitchell men work with their hands and take pride in simple, honest living. Grace, my baby sister, was still finding her place in the world at 16, but even then, she had this quiet way of watching everything, absorbing the family tensions like a sponge. Growing up, I always felt like I was looking at my family through a window rather than being fully inside with them. While Jake was in the garage with Dad learning to change oil and rebuild transmissions, I was curled up in my room with library books, writing in journals, asking questions that seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. Why do we do things this way? What if there's another? What would happen if we tried something different? My fascination with human behavior started early. I'd watch how my parents interacted, cataloging the way my mother would change the subject whenever my father's voice started to rise, noting how my father would shut down completely if anyone questioned his authority. I observed my classmates at Cedar Falls High, studying how the university professors' kids carried themselves differently than the kids whose families had been in town for generations. Psychology wasn't just something I wanted to study, it was the lens through which I made sense of a world that often felt foreign, even within my own home. The tension around education in our house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every report card I brought home with straight A's was met with a grunt of acknowledgement from my father and a worried look from my mother. When my guidance counselor called to discuss college applications during my junior year, I could hear my father's side of the conversation from upstairs. "College is for rich kids and people who don't want to work for a living," he told Mr. Peterson. "Sarah needs to learn that life isn't about chasing fancy degrees and thinking you're better than where you came from." But my maternal grandmother, Margaret Chen, saw something different in me. Grandma Maggie lived in Sacramento, but she'd visit every few months, always bringing books, always asking about my grades, always talking about possibilities that extended beyond Cedar Falls. She was the one who told me about scholarship opportunities, who helped me navigate the college application process, who insisted that education was the key to building the life I wanted, rather than simply accepting the life I was born into. When I got accepted to the University of Oregon with a partial scholarship, the fault lines in our family became chasms. My father saw it as a rejection of everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built. "You think we're not good enough for you," he'd say during our increasingly frequent arguments. "You think you need some fancy degree to be worth something." My mother tried to play peacekeeper, but I could see her torn between supporting my dreams and maintaining harmony with her husband. The first year of college was like stepping into a different universe. Suddenly asking questions wasn't just acceptable, it was encouraged. Challenging ideas wasn't seen as disrespectful, it was the whole point. I thrived in my psychology courses, fascinated by theories of family systems, attachment styles, and the ways childhood experiences shape adult relationships. Every textbook felt like it was explaining my own life back to me, but coming home for holidays became increasingly tense. My father would make cutting remarks about my college attitude, my mother would overcompensate by making all my favorite foods, and Jake would look at me like I was becoming a stranger. Grace was the only one who seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my classes, my professors, my new friends, who talked about books and ideas, and futures that extended beyond the city limits of Cedar Falls. The comments from my father grew sharper each semester. "Must be nice to sit around and talk about feelings all day while the rest of us work for a living. I suppose you think you understand people better than those of us who've actually lived in the real world. Don't forget where you come from, Sarah. These college friends of yours, they're not your real family." Each jab felt like a small death, chipping away at my confidence, making me question whether pursuing my dreams was worth the price I was paying at home. But my professors saw potential in me. Dr. Hayes, my abnormal psychology professor, encouraged me to consider graduate school. My research advisor, Dr. Martinez, helped me get involved in studies about family dynamics and intergenerational trauma. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and valued for who I was becoming, not just who I was expected to be. The breaking point had been building for months before graduation day. My senior year, I'd been accepted into a competitive graduate program in clinical psychology at Portland State University. The assistantship would cover my tuition and provide a small stipend for living expenses. It was everything I'd worked toward, the validation that all those years of feeling like an outsider in my own family hadn't been for nothing. When I told my parents about the graduate school acceptance over spring break, my father's reaction was swift and brutal. 4 years of this college nonsense wasn't enough. Now you want to waste even more time and money on degrees that won't teach you anything useful. My mother tried to interject with congratulations, but my father cut her off. "Linda, don't encourage that. Sarah needs to come home, get a real job, and stop pretending she's something she's not." That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling when I was 12, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The house felt smaller, more suffocating, like the walls were closing in on the person I'd worked so hard to become. I could hear my parents arguing in their bedroom, my mother's voice pleading, my father's voice firm and unyielding. The next morning, my father presented what he called his final offer. If I came home after graduation, he'd help me get a job at the hospital. Nothing fancy, probably housekeeping or food service, but honest work with decent benefits. I could live at home, save money, maybe eventually work my way up to something better. "This graduate school pipe dream ends now," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "It's time to grow up and join the real world." I spent the rest of spring break in a fog, mechanically going through the motions of family dinners and small talk while inside. I was wrestling with an impossible choice: disappoint the family that raised me, or abandon the future I'd spent 4 years building. My mother tried to bridge the gap, suggesting maybe I could defer graduate school for a year, maybe find a compromise that would make everyone happy, but I knew there was no middle ground. This was about more than education or career paths. This was about who I was allowed to be. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect Oregon spring mornings that make you believe anything is possible. I put on my cap and gown in my dorm room for the last time, looking at myself in the mirror and trying to feel the pride I'd expected to feel on this day. My summa cum laude cord felt heavy around my neck, not with honor but with the weight of expectations and disappointments that would follow me across that stage. My family arrived early, Jake carrying a bouquet of flowers, Grace bouncing with excitement, my mother beaming with poorly concealed pride. My father wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to my high school graduation, his expression neutral but present. For a moment I let myself hope that maybe this day would be different, that maybe seeing me graduate with highest honors would help him understand that I wasn't rejecting our family by pursuing my dreams. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Sitting with my fellow psychology majors, listening to the dean talk about our potential to make a difference in the world, I felt a surge of the excitement I'd been missing. These were my people, the ones who asked questions and sought answers, who believed that understanding human behavior was valuable work worthy of a lifetime's dedication. When they called my name for summa cum laude recognition, the applause felt like validation for every difficult conversation, every lonely holiday, every moment I doubted whether this path was worth the cost. After the ceremony, families gathered on the lawn for photos and celebration. I spotted my family near the psychology department building, my mother already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Grace practically vibrating with excitement to congratulate me. I walked toward them with my diploma in hand, feeling cautiously optimistic that maybe this achievement would be the bridge that finally connected my two worlds. "Congratulations, sweetheart," my mother said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "We're so proud of." Grace threw her arms around me next, chattering about how I was the first person in our family to graduate from college, how she'd told all her friends that her sister was the smartest person she knew. Even Jake managed a gruff "good job, sis," and an awkward shoulder pat. But my father stood apart, hands in his pockets, watching the celebration with an expression I couldn't read. When the family photos were finished and the initial excitement died down, he finally approached me. For a heart-stopping moment I thought he might actually congratulate me, might find a way to acknowledge this achievement even if he couldn't understand it. Instead, he looked at me with disappointment, so profound it took my breath away. "So this is it then," he said, his voice carrying across the lawn louder than necessary. "You think you're better than us now? You think this piece of paper makes you something special?" His gesture toward my diploma was dismissive, almost violent. "Well, let me tell you something, Sarah. Education without character means nothing. Degrees without..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Loyalty to your family mean nothing. The families around us began to quiet, sensing the tension, some turning to watch what was clearly becoming a confrontation. My mother reached for my father's arm, whispering, "Bob, please, not here, not today," but he shook her off. "4 years I've watched you turn into someone I don't recognize," he continued, his voice rising. "4 years of you acting like we're not good enough, like the life we built for you wasn't enough. Well, if that's how you feel, if you're so ashamed of where you come from, that you need to run off to more school to avoid coming home, then maybe you should just stay gone." The silence that followed felt eternal. I could feel the eyes of other families, other graduates, other parents who were celebrating instead of destroying. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her hand. Grace looked between my father and me, like she was watching something terrible happen, but couldn't understand what or why. Jake stared at the ground, his jaw clenched tight. I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "Dad, I'm not trying to be better than anyone. I'm just trying to be myself." His laugh was bitter, cutting. "Yourself? This isn't yourself, Sarah. This is some version of yourself that thinks our family, our values, our way of life isn't worth preserving. You want to chase after strangers who'll tell you what you want to hear instead of staying loyal to the people who raised you." The words hung in the air between us like a blade. I could see Professor Hayes in my peripheral vision, probably wondering if he should intervene. I could see my roommate Emma across the lawn, her face concerned as she noticed the drama unfolding. I could see the future I'd planned, the graduate program waiting for me in Portland, the life I'd worked so hard to build, all of it suddenly feeling fragile and uncertain. "You know what?" my father said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more violent than shouting. "If this is your choice, if you're so determined to abandon everything we taught you, then make it final. You're dead to me." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my knees weak. Around us, the celebration continued, but our little family bubble had become a disaster zone. My mother was sobbing openly now. Grace looked like she might be. Jake finally looked up, his expression shocked and angry, but whether at me or at our father, I couldn't tell. I stood there in my cap and gown, diploma in my hand, summa cum laude cord around my neck, feeling like everything I'd accomplished had just been reduced to ash. The applause and laughter from other families felt like it was coming from another universe, a place where parents celebrated their children's achievements instead of using them as weapons. "Bob, take it back." My mother finally found her voice. "Take it back right now. This is our daughter. This is Sarah's graduation day." But he was already walking away, his shoulders rigid with anger and disappointment. Jake hesitated for a moment, looking between my father's retreating figure and my devastated face, before following him toward the parking lot. Grace started to come toward me, but my mother caught her arm, shaking her head slightly. "I'm sorry," my mother whispered, her voice broken. "I'm so sorry, honey. He doesn't mean it. He's just scared of losing you." But as I watched my father disappear into the crowd, I knew he did mean every word, every cutting syllable. And for the first time in my life, I understood that no amount of achievement, no level of success, no demonstration of worth would ever be enough to earn his approval, because this wasn't really about education or career choices, or even respect for family. This was about control, and I had committed the unforgivable sin of growing beyond his ability to contain me. Standing there on what should have been the happiest day of my life, holding my diploma like evidence of my own guilt, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could spend the rest of my life trying to earn forgiveness for the crime of becoming myself, or I could accept that some people, even people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, will never understand or support the person you're meant. That night, back in my dorm room while my roommates celebrated at parties and restaurants with their families, I sat alone with my diploma and tried to process what had just happened. The silence felt deafening after 4 years of constant activity, study groups and social events. In a few days I'd have to pack up everything I owned and decide where to go next. Graduate school in Portland suddenly felt less like an opportunity and more like an escape route. I called my grandmother in Sacramento, the one person who had always believed in my potential without reservation. Her voice was warm and familiar, a balm after the devastation of the day. "Congratulations, my brilliant granddaughter," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Tell me everything about the ceremony." Instead, I found myself telling her about the confrontation, about my father's words, about the way my family had fractured on what should have been a day of celebration. She listened without interrupting, making small sounds of sympathy and understanding. "Sarah," she said when I finished, her voice gentle but firm, "sometimes the people who are supposed to celebrate our victories are the least equipped to understand them. Your father is operating from fear, not wisdom. Fear that you'll outgrow your need for him, fear that your success somehow diminishes his worth, fear that education will take you so far from home that you'll never come back." "But I never wanted to leave them behind," I said, tears finally coming. "I just wanted to grow." "Growth is threatening to people who have stopped growing themselves," she replied. "Your father sees your education as judgment of his choices, when really it's just you making different choices. There's a difference, sweetheart, even if he can't see it." We talked for another hour, my grandmother sharing stories about her own struggles as an immigrant, about the resistance she'd faced when she'd insisted on learning English and opening her own restaurant, about the family members who'd accused her of trying to be too American, too ambitious for a woman of her generation. "The path toward becoming yourself is often lonely," she told me before we hung up, "but it's the only path worth taking, and sometimes the people who love us have to learn to love the person we're becoming, not just the person we used to be." After we said goodbye, I sat in the darkness of my dorm room, thinking about choices and consequences, about loyalty and growth, about the price of becoming yourself when that self doesn't fit into the box others have built for you. Tomorrow, I would start packing. In a few weeks I would move to Portland and begin graduate school. I would build a life that reflected my values, my interests, my potential. But first, I had to grieve the father I'd always hoped to have, the one who would have celebrated my achievements instead of weaponizing them, the one who would have seen my growth as a reflection of good parenting, rather than a betrayal of family value. I had to accept that earning his approval might be impossible, and that my worth wasn't dependent on his recognition. As I finally fell asleep that night, still wearing my graduation dress, I couldn't have imagined that in just a few months I would discover why my father's rejection felt so particularly devastating, why our relationship had always felt slightly off-kilter, why I'd always felt like I was looking at my family from the outside. The truth was buried in my grandmother's attic, waiting in a handwritten will that would explain everything and change the trajectory of my life once again. But that discovery was still weeks away. For now, I was just a girl who had committed the crime of growing beyond her family's expectations, holding her diploma like a shield against the rejection that threatened to define her. Little did I know that sometimes the most painful rejections are actually the beginning of the most important discoveries, and that the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when you're ready to handle it. The moving truck pulled away from my dorm building on a Tuesday morning in late May, taking what felt like my entire world to Portland. Everything I owned fit into a 12-foot truck and my beat-up Honda Civic, a stark reminder of how simple my life had been, until now. Emma had driven up from Sacramento to help me move, her presence the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely as I left the University of Oregon campus for the last time. Portland felt overwhelming after 4 years in Cedar Falls. The traffic, the noise, the sheer number of people moving through downtown with purpose and urgency I didn't share. My graduate program wouldn't start until September, which gave me 3 months to find my footing in a city where I knew absolutely no one. The studio apartment I'd rented sight unseen in the Hawthorne district was tiny but affordable, with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that faced an alley where cats fought over territory every night around 2 in the morning. The silence from my family was deafening. My mother had called twice since graduation day, both conversations stilted and careful, dancing around the elephant in the room. She'd update me on Grace's summer job at the ice cream shop, Jake's plans to start community college in the fall, the weather, anything except my father's ultimatum or my new life in Portland. When I'd try to share details about my apartment or my excitement about starting graduate school, she'd change the subject with the skill of someone who'd had years of practice avoiding difficult topics. Grace had texted me sporadically, usually late at night when she probably thought our parents were asleep. "Dad still won't talk about you," she'd written 2 weeks after I'd moved. "Mom cries when she thinks we're not looking. Jake says, you made your choice and now you have to live with it. I think they're all being stupid." Her messages were lifelines, proof that I hadn't imagined the closeness we'd shared, that someone in my family still believed I was worth maintaining contact with. The isolation hit me harder than I'd expected. For 4 years I'd been surrounded by classmates, study groups, professors, a built-in community that understood my goals and supported my ambition. Portland was full of interesting people, but making genuine connections felt impossible when I was carrying so much unresolved grief about my family situation. I'd start conversations at coffee shops or neighborhood events, but inevitably someone would ask about my background, my family, why I'd moved to Portland, and I'd find myself either lying or oversharing in ways that made people uncomfortable. My savings account dwindled faster than I'd anticipated. Portland was more expensive than Cedar Falls, and my graduate assistantship wouldn't start providing income until September. I found a part-time job at a bookstore in Hawthorne, shelving novels and ringing up customers who browsed for hours without buying anything. The work was mindless but soothing, surrounded by books and quiet people who respected each other's space. My manager, Carol, was a woman in her 50s who'd moved to Portland after her own family crisis, and she seemed to understand without being told that I was rebuilding my life from scratch. The loneliness was crushing some day. I'd walk through neighborhoods full of families, past coffee shops where groups of friends met for weekend brunches, past parks where parents pushed their children on swings, and feel like I was observing life through glass. I'd made the choice to prioritize my education and future over family harmony, but nobody had warned me how empty victory could feel when you had no one to share it with. 3 weeks into June, my mother called with news that shattered what little equilibrium I'd managed to build. "Your grandmother is in the hospital," she said without preamble. "She had a stroke yesterday morning. We're driving down to Sacramento this afternoon." The world tilted sideways. Grandma Maggie had been my anchor, my champion, the one person who'd never questioned my dreams, or made me feel guilty for pursuing them. She was supposed to be invincible, the woman who'd survived immigration, widowhood, business ownership, and decades of family drama with grace and determination. The idea of her lying unconscious in a hospital bed felt impossible to process. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask. "Bad." My mother's voice was thick with tears. "The doctors aren't sure if she'll wake up. Sarah, I know things have been difficult with your father, but she's been asking for you. Before the stroke, she kept talking about wanting to see you, wanting to make sure you were settling in okay." The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. I'd been so focused on my own drama, my own wounded feelings, that I hadn't called my grandmother in 2 weeks. The last time we'd spoken, she'd sounded tired, but I'd attributed it to her age and the California heat. I should have visited her before moving to Portland. I should have insisted on seeing her more often during college. I should have paid better attention to the signs that something was wrong. "I'll drive down tonight," I said, already mentally calculating the drive time to Sacramento. "Sarah," my mother's voice was careful, "your father will be there." The reminder hit like cold water. In my panic about my grandmother, I'd forgotten that going to Sacramento meant facing my family, meant walking into a situation where my father had declared me dead to him just a month ago. But none of that mattered now. My grandmother needed me, and I would deal with whatever consequences came from showing up. The drive to Sacramento took 6 hours through mountain passes and Central Valley farmland that stretched endlessly under a blazing sun. I'd left Portland at midnight, hoping to avoid traffic and arrive at the hospital early enough to see my grandmother before the rest of the family arrived. The Honda's air conditioning had given up somewhere near Eugene, so I drove with windows down, hot wind whipping through my hair as I tried to prepare myself for what was waiting. Sacramento General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and I found my grandmother's room on the 4th floor, following signs through corridors that all looked identical. She was in the ICU, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed, her normally vibrant face pale and slack against the white pillow. Seeing her like that, so small and fragile, broke something inside me that I'd been holding together through sheer willpower. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, talking to her the way the nurses had suggested. I told her about Portland, about my apartment with the creaky floors, about the bookstore job and the graduate program starting in September. I told her about the loneliness, about missing my family, about wondering if I'd made the right choice. Her fingers felt paper thin in mine, warm but unresponsive. "I need you to wake up," I whispered. "I need you to tell me that everything's going to be okay, that families can heal from this kind of damage. I need you to remind me why education was worth losing everyone else." The sound of voices in the hallway made me look up. My family had arrived, their voices carrying the particular combination of stress and exhaustion that comes with hospital vigils. I heard my father's voice first, talking to a nurse about visiting hours and medical updates. Then my mother, asking questions about treatment options and prognosis. Jake and Grace were there too, their younger voices subdued by the gravity of the situation. When they walked into the room and saw me sitting beside my grandmother's bed, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father stopped short, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been pain. My mother's eyes filled with tears, whether from relief or renewed grief, I couldn't tell. Grace immediately started toward me, but Jake caught her arm, holding her back with a subtle shake of his head. "Sarah," my mother said softly, as if testing whether saying my name would cause an explosion. "Mom," I replied, standing up, but not moving away from my grandmother's bedside. My father stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't bring himself to say. Finally he spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "I didn't know you were coming. She's my grandmother too," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. The silence that followed was excruciating. Grace fidgeted beside Jake, clearly wanting to hug me but uncertain about the family politics involved. My mother looked between my father and me like she was watching a bomb that might explode at any moment. The only sound was the steady beeping of my grandmother's monitors and the whisper of air conditioning. "The doctor said she's stable," my mother finally said, addressing me directly. "No changes since yesterday, but no deterioration either. They're running more tests this afternoon." We fell into an awkward routine over the next several hours. My parents took turns sitting with my grandmother while the other went to the cafeteria or made phone calls to other relatives. Jake and Grace alternated between the waiting room and my grandmother's bedside, both of them clearly struggling with the tension between wanting to reconnect with me and not wanting to upset our father further. I stayed as close to my grandmother as the nurses would allow, reading to her from a book of poetry she'd given me for my 18th birthday. It was during one of these reading sessions, when my parents had gone to speak with the doctor and Jake and Grace were getting dinner, that my grandmother's eyes fluttered open. For a moment she seemed confused, scanning the room with unfocused eyes, then her gaze landed on me, and despite the stroke's effects, I saw recognition and relief. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice raspy from the reading tube they'd removed that morning. "I'm here, Grandma," I said, leaning closer so she could see me clearly. "I'm right here." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Need to tell you," she said slowly, each word an effort. "Important. Don't try to talk right now," I said. "Just rest. You're going to be okay." But she shook her head slightly, her eyes urgent. "House," she managed. "Recipe box. Kitchen." "Your recipe box," she nodded, exhaustion already pulling her back toward sleep. "Truth," she whispered. "About your father." Before I could ask what she meant, my parents returned with the doctor, and my grandmother had slipped back into unconsciousness. The doctor explained that brief moments of awareness were common after strokes, that they shouldn't read too much into it either positively or negatively. But I couldn't stop thinking about her words, about the urgency in her eyes when she'd mentioned the recipe box and my father. My grandmother died peacefully 2 days later, with all of us surrounding her bed. Despite everything that had happened between my father and me, grief made us temporarily allies in our shared loss. She'd been the matriarch of our family, the one who'd held everyone together through divorces, job losses, health scares, and now this final fracture between my father and me. Her death felt like the end of more than just her life. It felt like the end of our family's ability to function as a unit. The funeral arrangements kept us busy for several days, providing neutral territory where my father and I could coexist without directly addressing our conflict. We planned the service together, chose flowers, wrote obituaries, contacted relatives. My father was civil but distant, treating me like a helpful stranger rather than his daughter. My mother tried to bridge the gap with careful conversation and meaningful looks, but the chasm between my father and me remained wide and deep. After the funeral, my Aunt Patricia, my grandmother's other daughter, invited the family back to my grandmother's house to go through her belongings. The Victorian house in Sacramento's Midtown had been my second home growing up, full of treasures and memories that needed to be sorted, divided, or donated. My grandmother had been methodical about most things, but her personal belongings were scattered throughout the house in a way that would require careful searching. My mother and aunt tackled the bedroom and closets, while my father and Jake dealt with the garage and basement. Grace appointed herself guardian of my grandmother's book collection, carefully cataloging titles and deciding which ones to keep. I volunteered for the kitchen, partly because I'd always loved cooking with my grandmother, but mostly because I kept thinking about her last words about the recipe box and some kind of truth about my father. The kitchen had always been the heart of my grandmother's house, with its checkerboard linoleum, vintage appliances, and walls covered with family photos spanning 6 decades. The recipe box sat on the counter where it had always been, a wooden container painted with faded strawberries that had held my grandmother's collection of handwritten recipes, cooking tips clipped from magazines, and notes about family food preferences. I'd expected to find her famous chocolate chip cookie recipe, her secret ingredient for pot roast, maybe some notes about which relatives were allergic to what. What I found instead, tucked between her recipe for banana bread and instructions for canning peaches, was a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's careful script. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter dated just 3 months earlier, along with what appeared to be a legal document. My hands shook as I read my grandmother's familiar handwriting, explaining that she'd been waiting for the right time to share this information with me, that she'd hoped the family tensions would resolve themselves naturally, but that she couldn't risk taking this secret to her grave. The legal document was her will, updated just 6 weeks before her stroke, but it wasn't the will that made me sink into one of her kitchen chairs with shock. It was the letter that accompanied it, explaining why she was leaving me not just money for graduate school, but also a sealed envelope that had been hidden in her safety deposit box for 25 years. The envelope contained documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my identity: birth records with different information than I'd ever seen, medical records from my mother's pregnancy that didn't match my father's timeline, and most shocking of all, correspondence between my mother and a man named Tom Bradley, discussing child support, visitation rights, and a promise to never reveal his identity to me, unless my mother specifically requested it. Tom Bradley. Not Robert Mitchell. Tom Bradley was my biological father. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a life well lived, staring at documents that reframed my entire existence. Every fight with my father about education suddenly made sense. Every moment I'd felt like an outsider in my own family gained new context. Every time he'd accused me of thinking I was better than them, every time he'd questioned my loyalty, every time he'd treated my achievements as personal attacks, it all clicked into place with devastating clarity. Robert Mitchell had raised me as his own daughter, but I wasn't his blood. He'd married my mother when I was 2.5 years old, had given me his name, had provided for me financially and practically, but had never legally adopted me. I was a constant reminder of my mother's life before him, of choices she'd made that he'd agreed to live with but apparently never fully accepted. The correspondence between my mother and Tom Bradley painted a picture of a young woman trying to navigate an unplanned pregnancy with a man who wasn't ready for fatherhood. Tom had been 24, just starting a construction business in Bend, Oregon. My mother had been 22, working at the bank, living with her parents while she figured out her next steps. They'd dated for 8 months, seriously enough that she'd thought they were building toward something permanent, but when she'd told him about the pregnancy, he'd panicked. The letters showed a man torn between responsibility and fear, someone who wanted to do the right thing but wasn't sure what that meant. He'd offered to pay child support, had even suggested they could try to make a relationship work for the baby's sake, but my mother had ultimately decided she'd rather raise me alone than force a reluctant partner into parenthood. When she'd met Robert Mitchell 2 years later, Tom had agreed to step back completely, signing papers that relinquished his parental rights, and promised that he'd respect Robert's role as my father, but he'd kept track of me over the years. The letters showed periodic updates from my mother about my development, my interests, my academic achievements. She'd sent him school photos, report cards, news about my college acceptance. He'd continued sending money periodically, not formal child support, but contributions to my education fund that my mother had apparently never told me about. The final letter in the sequence was dated just 2 years earlier, when I'd started my senior year of college. Tom had written asking whether it would be appropriate for him to reach out directly, whether I might be interested in knowing him now that I was an adult, capable of making my own decisions about relationships. My mother had responded that the timing wasn't right, that Robert was already struggling with my college choices, that introducing biological father complications would only make things worse. I could hear my family moving through other parts of the house, sorting through my grandmother's belongings, completely unaware that I was sitting in the kitchen having my entire world reorganized. The sound of my mother's voice floating down from upstairs, talking to my aunt about my grandmother's jewelry, felt surreal. She'd kept this secret for 25 years, had watched me struggle to connect with the man I thought was my father, had listened to countless fights about education and loyalty and family values, without ever acknowledging the fundamental lie that made those fights so painful. The betrayal felt overwhelming, but underneath it was something else: relief, the feeling of never quite fitting, of always being slightly out of sync with my family's rhythms, of feeling like I was disappointing people simply by being myself. All of it finally made sense. I wasn't crazy or ungrateful, or inherently difficult. I was just trying to forge a relationship with someone who'd never fully accepted me as his own. But that relief was immediately followed by anger. My mother had let me believe that Robert's rejection was about my choices, my education, my values. She'd allowed me to internalize his disappointment as my own failure when the truth was that he'd been fighting against accepting me long before I'd ever applied to college. The graduation day disaster, his declaration that I was dead to him, all of it gained new dimensions when viewed through the lens of him finally having permission to stop pretending I was really his daughter. I also felt a complicated mix of curiosity and fear about Tom Bradley. Was he still in Bend? Did he still think about me? Had he followed my college graduation from a distance, wondering if I'd ever want to know him? The letters suggested someone who genuinely cared about my well-being from afar, but that didn't erase the fact that he'd chosen not to be part of my daily life, had been willing to let another man raise his biological child, rather than face the complexity of shared custody and awkward family dynamics. Footsteps on the kitchen stairs interrupted my emotional spiral. Grace appeared in the doorway, her arms full of books she'd selected from my grandmother's collection. "Sarah, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I quickly folded the letters and tucked them back into the envelope, my heart racing with the fear of being discovered. "Just reading some of Grandma's old recipes," I said, trying to sound casual. "You know how she always wrote little notes about family preferences on everything." Grace set down her stack of books and came closer, her 16-year-old intuition apparently picking up on the tension I was trying to hide. "Are you sure? You look really upset." "I'm just sad," I said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Going through her things makes her death feel more real." Grace nodded, accepting this explanation, and began telling me about the books she'd chosen, including several volumes of poetry that had been my grandmother's favorite. Her chatter gave me time to compose myself, to figure out how I was going to handle this revelation, whether I would confront my mother immediately, or take time to process what I'd learned. As the afternoon wore on and we finished sorting through my grandmother's belongings, I found myself studying my family with new eyes. My mother, carefully wrapping my grandmother's china, and making decisions about which pieces should go to which relatives, had hidden a fundamental truth about my identity for my entire life. My father, or rather the man who'd raised me, had agreed to take on a ready-made family, but had apparently never stopped resenting the arrangement. Jake and Grace, who shared his DNA in ways I never would, had grown up with advantages I'd never possessed: the security of belonging, the confidence that their achievements would be celebrated rather than viewed as threats. When we finally finished at my grandmother's house, loading our cars with boxes of memories and personal items, my family prepared to drive back to Cedar Falls. I was planning to return to Portland, to my tiny apartment, and my summer job at the bookstore, but the weight of what I'd discovered made the prospect of being alone feel unbearable. "Sarah," my mother said, as we stood beside our cars in my grandmother's driveway, "why don't you come home with us for a few days? I know things have been difficult, but losing Grandma has reminded me how important family is." I looked at her, this woman who'd shaped my entire understanding of identity and belonging, wondering how many other secrets she was carrying. "I need to get back to Portland," I said. "I have work to..." But even as I said it, I knew I wasn't ready to face my empty apartment and the implications of what I'd learned. I needed time to think, to decide whether and how to confront my mother about the lies she'd told, whether to try to contact Tom Bradley, whether to tell the man I'd called Dad for 22 years that I knew the truth about our relationship. The drive back to Portland felt endless, every mile marker another step away from the family I'd thought I knew, and toward a future that had suddenly become completely uncertain. The documents from my grandmother's recipe box sat in the passenger seat like evidence of a crime, proof that everything I'd believed about myself was built on a foundation of well-intentioned deception. As I finally pulled into my parking space in Portland, exhausted and emotionally drained, I realized that my grandmother's death had given me more than just grief to process. She'd handed me the key to understanding why I'd always felt like an outsider, but she'd also given me a choice about what to do with that knowledge. I could use it to rebuild my relationships with the family that had raised me, or I could use it to find the family that had created me. Either way, the girl who'd driven to Sacramento to say goodbye to her grandmother was gone forever, replaced by a woman who finally understood why she'd never quite belonged where she was supposed to fit. The decision to leave everything behind came to me during a sleepless night, 3 days after returning from my grandmother's funeral. I sat at my kitchen table in Portland, staring at the documents that had rewritten my entire history, and realized I couldn't continue living a life built on lies and half-truths. The family that had raised me would never see me clearly because they were looking at me through the lens of old resentments and unspoken secrets. The man who might actually be able to accept me for who I was, lived 2 hours away in Bend, completely unaware that I knew he existed. I called in sick to my bookstore job and spent the morning researching Tom Bradley online. What I found painted a picture of a successful contractor who'd built Bradley Construction into one of Bend's most respected firms. His company website featured photos of custom homes, commercial buildings, and restoration projects throughout Central Oregon. The professional headshots showed a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that looked remarkably similar to my own. Several local newspaper articles mentioned his involvement in community projects, charity work, and his marriage to Elena Bradley 15 years earlier. The most recent article was from just 6 months ago, featuring Bradley Construction's work on affordable housing initiatives in Bend. The photo showed Tom with his crew, all of them wearing matching company t-shirts and hard hats, standing in front of a newly completed duplex. He looked genuinely happy in the photo, proud of his work and his team. It struck me that while I'd been struggling to fit into the Mitchell family dynamics, Tom Bradley had been building a life that seemed to align with values I recognized in myself: education, community service, creating something meaningful. But the most shocking discovery came when I found Elena Bradley's Facebook page. Her profile was mostly private, but her public posts included family photos that made my heart stop. She and Tom had a son, Marcus, who looked to be about 17 years old. In the photos where I could see him clearly, the family resemblance was unmistakable: same dark hair, same stubborn chin, same way of tilting his head when he smiled. I had a half-brother I'd never known existed, someone who'd grown up with the father I'd never had the chance to know. The weight of everything I'd lost hit me like a physical blow. Not just the obvious things like having a relationship with my biological father, but all the smaller moments that make up a childhood. Birthday parties where Tom might have been proud of my achievements instead of threatened by them. Family dinners where my questions about the world would have been encouraged rather than dismissed. A brother who might have understood my curiosity, my ambition, my need to explore possibilities beyond the boundaries of a small town. I spent the next 2 days crafting and discarding emails to Tom Bradley. How do you introduce yourself to the father who gave you life but never got to know you? How do you explain that you've discovered his existence through a 25-year-old correspondence hidden in your dead grandmother's recipe box? Every version I wrote sounded either too casual, or too dramatic, too accusatory, or too desperate. Finally, I settled on something simple and direct. I explained who I was, mentioned that I'd recently learned about our connection through my grandmother's papers, and said I'd be interested in meeting if he was open to that possibility. I included my phone number and email address, then hit send before I could lose my nerve. The response came faster than I'd expected. Less than 4 hours later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Sarah, this is Tom Bradley." His voice was deeper than I'd imagined, with a slight Oregon accent that sounded like home in a way my adoptive father's voice never had. "I got your email. I've been hoping for this call for 23 years. That first conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Tom explained that he'd never stopped thinking about me, had followed my progress through the updates my mother had sporadically provided, had wanted to reach out directly countless times, but had honored my mother's wishes to let Robert Mitchell be my father. He talked about the regret he'd carried, the wondering about what kind of person I'd become, the fear that I might hate him for not fighting harder to be part of my life. "Your mother sent me your high school graduation photo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You looked so much like my sister did at that age, I had to sit down. When she told me you were going to college for psychology, I wasn't surprised. You always seemed like someone who'd want to understand how people work, how families fit together or fall apart." I told him about the graduation day disaster, about my father's declaration that I was dead to him, about the way I'd never quite fit into the Mitchell family dynamics. despite my best efforts. Tom listened without interrupting, making occasional sounds of understanding or frustration. "I'm sorry," he said when I finished. "I'm sorry Robert couldn't see what an amazing daughter he was raising. I'm sorry your mother felt like she had to keep secrets to protect everyone. And I'm really sorry that you've been carrying this feeling of not belonging, when the truth is, you've always belonged somewhere, you just didn't know where to look." By the end of that conversation, we'd made plans for me to drive to Bend the following weekend. Tom wanted me to meet Elena and Marcus, to see the life he'd built, to start figuring out if there was space for me in the Bradley family constellation. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. What if I didn't fit any better with my biological family than I had with my adoptive one? What if 23 years of separation was too much distance to bridge? But underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt in months: hope. For the first time since graduation day, I had somewhere to go that might feel like home. The drive to Bend took me through the Cascade Mountains on a route I'd never traveled before. The landscape was dramatically different from the Willamette Valley, all high desert and volcanic peaks, sagebrush, and juniper trees. As I got closer to the city, I could see Mount Bachelor looming in the distance, snow-capped even in July. The whole environment felt more expansive than anywhere I'd lived, like there was room to breathe and grow and become whoever you were meant to be. Tom had given me the address of his home office, a converted workshop behind the main house where he handled the administrative side of Bradley construction. I pulled into the driveway of a craftsman-style home that looked like something from a magazine, all natural wood and stone with landscaping that complemented rather than fought the high desert environment. Even before I got out of my car, I could see the care and skill that had gone into every detail of the construction. Tom emerged from the workshop as I was gathering my courage to walk to the front door. In person, he was taller than I'd expected, probably 6'2", with the kind of build that comes from years of physical labor, but it was his smile that stopped me in my tracks, warm and genuine and containing an echo of my own face when I was truly happy. "Sarah," he said, and the way he said my name was different from how anyone in my family had ever said it. Not like he was testing whether I was going to cause problems, not like he was disappointed in who I'd turned out to be, but like he was genuinely glad to see me. The hug that followed was awkward at first, two strangers navigating the strange territory of biological connection without shared history, but there was something familiar about it too, like muscle memory of a relationship that had never actually existed. Elena appeared in the doorway of the main house, and I felt a moment of panic about how this woman would receive the living reminder of her husband's life before her. But her smile was as warm as Tom's, and she approached with the confidence of someone who'd had time to process the situation, and had decided to embrace, rather than resent it. "We've been so excited to meet you," she said, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. "Tom has been talking about you non-stop since you called." I had to threaten to hide his phone to get him to calm down. Marcus emerged more reluctantly, 17-year-old social awkwardness combined with the complexity of suddenly discovering an older sister. He looked so much like me that it was almost jarring, but where I'd learned to be cautious and careful, he had an openness that suggested he'd grown up feeling secure in his family's affection. "So you're the famous Sarah," he said, and I caught the hint of protective challenge in his voice. "Dad's been wondering about you my whole life." The next few hours unfolded like something from a different universe than the family dynamics I'd grown up with. Elena had prepared lunch with the kind of attention to detail that suggested genuine care rather than obligation. Tom asked thoughtful questions about my education, my goals, my experience in Portland, listening to my answers with the kind of focus that made me feel like my thoughts and opinions actually mattered. Marcus, once he got over his initial wariness, turned out to be sharp and funny, with interests that ranged from environmental science to rock climbing to building apps in his spare time. He was planning to study engineering at Oregon State in the fall, and when I mentioned my psychology background, he immediately started asking questions about the intersection of technology and human behavior that were more sophisticated than most college students could manage. But it was the family's dynamic that amazed me most. When Tom disagreed with something Marcus said about environmental policy, he engaged with the substance of the argument rather than dismissing it as youthful idealism. When Elena brought up concerns about Marcus's plan to spend a gap year traveling before college, The conversation that followed was collaborative rather than authoritarian. They talked to each other like they genuinely enjoyed each other's company, like they were interested in each other's perspectives, even when they didn't agree. "This is probably overwhelming," Elena said during a quiet moment when Tom and Marcus were debating the merits of different climbing routes on Smith Rock. "Finding out about us, meeting everyone at once. It doesn't have to mean anything more than what you want it to mean." Her generosity in giving me permission to set my own boundaries was exactly what I needed to hear. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted. "In my experience, families don't actually work this well." Elena's expression grew more serious. "Tom told me about what happened at your graduation. That must have been devastating, especially from someone you thought of as your father. The worst part was feeling like I deserved it somehow. Like if I just tried harder to be the daughter he wanted, maybe he would have been proud instead of ashamed." "That's not how parenthood works," she said firmly. "Parents are supposed to adapt to the children they have, not force their children to become someone else to earn love." "What happened to you at graduation wasn't about your choices or your character, it was about his limitations." It was such a simple concept, but hearing it from someone who'd successfully navigated parenthood made it feel revolutionary. I'd spent so many years trying to earn acceptance by becoming smaller, quieter, more compliant when the problem had never been with me at all. That evening, Tom took me on a tour of some of the houses his company had built around Bend. Each project reflected the same attention to quality and beauty I'd seen in his own home, but more than that, they showed someone who took pride in creating lasting value, in building something meaningful rather than just profitable. "I wanted you to see this," he said as we stood in front of a small development of affordable homes his company had completed the year before. "After I learned you were studying psychology, I kept thinking about how people need more than just shelter. They need homes that make them feel proud, spaces that support the kind of life they want to build." I could see my own values reflected in his work, the same desire to understand and support human flourishing that had drawn me to psychology. For the first time in my life, I was seeing where my interests and instincts might have come from, why I'd always been drawn to questions about human potential and family dynamics and the conditions that help people thrive. "I have something for you," Tom said as we sat on his back deck that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. He handed me a thick manila envelope that had clearly been prepared with care. Inside were copies of every photo my mother had sent him over the years, along with the report cards and school updates she'd shared. But there were also things I hadn't expected: birthday cards he'd bought, but never sent, letters he'd written but never mailed, newspaper clippings about child development and educational opportunities that he'd saved in case he ever got the chance to be involved in my upbringing. "I know it's probably too little too late," he said, his voice uncertain for the first time all day, "but I wanted you to know that even though I wasn't there, I was always thinking about you, always hoping you were happy and healthy, and becoming whoever you were meant to be." Looking through the documents, I could see the outline of a parallel life, a version of childhood where my achievements would have been celebrated, where my questions would have been encouraged, where my dreams would have been supported rather than seen as threats. It was heartbreaking and healing at the same time, evidence that I'd always been worthy of that kind of love even if I hadn't received it. "Why didn't you fight for custody?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice all day. "Why did you let Robert Mitchell become my father when you clearly wanted to be involved?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. "I was 24 and scared," he said finally. "Your mother was so sure that giving you a stable two-parent home was the right thing to do, and I didn't trust myself to argue with her. I thought maybe she was right. Maybe you'd be better off with someone who was ready to be a full-time father instead of someone who was still figuring out how to be a grown-up." He turned to look at me directly. "It's the biggest regret of my life. Not fighting harder, not insisting on staying involved, not trusting that love was more important than perfect circumstances. I've spent 23 years wondering what kind of person you were becoming, whether you were happy, whether you knew you were loved." The honesty in his voice, the genuine remorse for choices that couldn't be undone, felt like a gift. Not because it erased the pain of growing up without him, but because it validated that the connection I was feeling wasn't one-sided, that the sense of belonging I'd experienced in just one day with the Bradley family was real and reciprocated. When I finally drove back to Portland the next day, my car was full of gifts: books, Marcus thought I'd enjoy, homemade jam from Elena's garden, photos and contact information for relatives I'd never known existed. But more than the physical items, I was carrying something intangible but infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that there was a place in the world where I fit naturally, where my curiosity was welcomed and my ambitions were supported. The contrast with my childhood became even starker in the days that followed. Tom called regularly not to check up on me or criticize my choices, but to hear about my life and share updates about his own. Marcus texted me articles about psychology research he'd found interesting, questions about college life, silly memes that made me laugh. Elena sent care packages with homemade cookies and notes of encouragement about starting graduate school. It was everything I'd always wanted from a family: genuine interest in my well-being, pride in my accomplishments, support for my dreams, and acceptance of who I was becoming rather than pressure to become someone else. The generosity of their welcome felt almost too good to be true, like I was waiting for them to discover some fatal flaw in my character that would justify withdrawing their affection. But weeks passed, and the Bradley family continued to treat me like I'd always belonged with. Tom invited me to join him and Marcus on a camping trip to Crater Lake. Elena asked for my opinion on landscaping decisions for their backyard. Marcus requested my help with his college application essay. They created space for me in their family traditions without making me feel like I was imposing or that their acceptance was conditional on my perfect behavior. The contrast with my life in Portland became increasingly difficult to ignore. My studio apartment felt cramped and lonely after experiencing the warmth of the Bradley home. My job at the bookstore provided income but no sense of purpose or connection. Even my excitement about starting graduate school was complicated by the knowledge that I'd be studying family dynamics while living with the aftermath of my own family's dysfunction. 3 weeks after my first visit to Bend, I made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. I gave notice at my job, broke my lease on my Portland apartment, and accepted Tom's offer to rent the small guest house on his property while I figured out my next step. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a way to explore this new family connection without committing to anything beyond what felt right in the moment. The move itself was simple since I still owned so little. The same Honda Civic that had carried me from Cedar Falls to Portland now transported my belongings to Bend. But this time, the journey felt like coming home rather than running away. Tom and Marcus helped me move my furniture into the guest house, a converted workshop with exposed beams and windows that looked out on the high desert landscape. "This doesn't have to mean anything more than you want it to," Tom said as we finished setting up my new living space, echoing Elena's words from my first visit. "Take whatever time you need to figure out what kind of relationship works for all of us." But even as he gave me permission to keep my emotional distance, I could see the hope in his eyes, the careful joy of someone who'd been given an unexpected second chance at fatherhood. The guest house felt like a bridge between my old life and whatever came next, a safe space to explore what it might mean to belong somewhere without having to earn that belonging through perfect compliance or constant achievement. That first night in Bend, lying in bed in the guest house with the unfamiliar sounds of high desert wildlife outside my windows, I realized I was experiencing something I'd never felt before: the peace that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. Not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was honest. The Bradley family saw me clearly and liked what they saw. They were interested in who I was becoming rather than disappointed in who I was. For the first time since graduation day, I fell asleep without the weight of trying to earn my place in the world. I was exactly where I belonged, with people who wanted me there simply because I was myself. The journey to this moment had been painful and complicated, full of lies and revelations and difficult choices, but it had led me to something I'd never dared to hope for: a family that felt like home. The phone call from my mother came on a Thursday evening in October, 3 months after I'd moved to Bend. I was sitting on the deck of the guest house, grading papers for the undergraduate psychology course, where I'd started working as a teaching assistant, when my phone rang with the familiar Cedar Falls area code I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Sarah, we need to talk." Her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since the hospital vigil after my grandmother's stroke. "I know what you found in Grandma's recipe box. I know you've been in contact with Tom Bradley." The words hit like cold water. I'd been so careful, so discreet about my new relationship with my biological family, that I'd foolishly believed I could keep both worlds separate indefinitely. How do you know that? Grace saw his construction company's logo on a sweatshirt you were wearing in one of your Instagram photos, she said, her voice tight with hurt and anger. She mentioned it to your father, and he put the pieces together. He's been asking questions around town, making phone calls. Sarah, he knows everything. My heart started racing as I processed the implications. Robert Mitchell wasn't the type of man to quietly absorb this kind of revelation. If he'd discovered that I'd not only learned the truth about my paternity, but had actively sought out a relationship with my biological father, his response would be swift and devastating. What's he going to do? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. He's driving to Bend tomorrow morning, my mother said, her voice breaking slightly. He says he's going to have a conversation with Tom Bradley about boundaries and respect for the family that actually raised you. Sarah, I'm scared about what he might do or say. You know how he gets when he feels like someone's taken something that belongs to him. The possessiveness in that statement made my stomach turn. Even now, even after everything that had happened, Robert Mitchell still saw me as property rather than a person capable of making my own decisions about relationships. The thought of him confronting Tom, of bringing his anger and resentment into the peaceful world I'd been building in Bend, filled me with protective fury. I have to warn Tom, I said, already standing up and reaching for my keys. Sarah, wait, my mother said, her voice urgent. There's more. I'm coming with him. I can't let him do this alone, and I can't let you face this without someone who understands the whole situation. We'll be there tomorrow afternoon. The line went silent as we both absorbed the magnitude of what was about to happen. For months, I'd been living in a kind of emotional limbo, building a relationship with my biological family, while avoiding any resolution with the family that had raised me. Tomorrow, those two worlds were going to collide, whether I was ready or not. I called Tom immediately, explaining the situation as calmly as I could manage. His response was characteristically steady and thoughtful. Do you want me to handle this alone, or do you want to be part of the conversation? He asked. I need to be there, I said, without hesitation. This is about me, and I'm tired of other people making decisions about my life without my input. Then we'll face it together, he said simply. Elena and I will make sure Marcus isn't around when they arrive. Whatever happens, whatever gets said, you don't have to handle this by yourself. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining different scenarios for how the confrontation might unfold, each one more volatile than the last. Robert Mitchell had a talent for finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them, and I worried about how Tom would handle that kind of attack. Despite his success and confidence in his professional life, Tom still carried guilt about his absence from my childhood, still questioned whether he'd made the right choices 23 years ago. The next morning, I threw myself into preparing for battle. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel confident and adult. I gathered documents that proved my right to make my own decisions about family relationships. Most importantly, I rehearsed the things I needed to say, the boundaries I needed to establish, the truths I needed to speak regardless of how they were received. Tom and Elena met me at the main house around noon, both of them calmer than I felt, but clearly taking the situation serious. Elena had prepared coffee and sandwiches, creating an environment that was welcoming but not subservient. Tom had arranged the living room furniture to facilitate conversation rather than confrontation, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his watch. Whatever happens today, Elena said as we waited, remember that you belong here. You're not a guest or an obligation, or someone who has to earn your place. You're family, and nothing anyone says can change that. Her words steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. For so many years, my sense of belonging had been conditional, dependent on my ability to meet other people's expectations, or avoid triggering their insecurities. Having someone affirm my right to exist in their space without qualification felt revolutionary. My mother's car pulled into the driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, followed immediately by Robert's truck. Through the living room window, I watched them approach the front door, my mother looking nervous and apologetic, Robert looking like a man preparing for war. Even from a distance, I could see the controlled fury in his posture, the way he'd armored himself in righteous indignation. Tom answered the door with dignified courtesy, introducing himself and Elena, inviting them inside with the kind of hospitality that acknowledged the gravity of the situation without escalating it. But I could see Robert's immediate assessment of the house, the quality of the furnishings, the evidence of financial success that probably felt like another insult to his sense of adequacy. "Robert Mitchell," he said, his handshake with Tom lasting a beat too long, his grip probably tighter than necessary. "I believe you know my daughter." The deliberate emphasis on my daughter was clearly intended as a territorial marker, but Tom didn't rise to the bait. "Sarah, yeah, please, have a seat. Can we get you some coffee?" As we settled into the living room, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother kept glancing between Robert and me, clearly hoping someone would find a way to diffuse the situation before it exploded. Robert sat rigidly in his chair, his gaze moving around the room in a way that catalogued everything he saw as evidence of superiority he'd have to tear down. "Let me be direct," Robert began, his voice carrying the controlled anger I remembered from my childhood. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing here, Bradley, but Sarah has a family. She has people who've invested 23 years in raising her, supporting her, giving her everything she needed to become the person she is today." Tom listened without interrupting, his expression remaining neutral despite the obvious hostility in Robert's tone. "And then you show up," Robert continued, "with your fancy house and your successful business, playing the long-lost father card, trying to buy her affection with things we could never afford to give her. Well, let me tell you something about Sarah. She's loyal. She knows where she came from and she knows who was there when it mattered." I felt something snap inside me, 23 years of accumulated frustration finally reaching its breaking point. "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through Robert's monologue. "Just stop talking about me like I'm not sitting right here." Robert turned to me with surprise, clearly not expecting me to interrupt his prepared speech. "Sarah, I'm trying to protect you from people who want to use you." "Use me for what?" I asked, standing up so I could face him direct. "Tom doesn't need anything from me. He's not trying to get money or status or bragging rights, he just wants to know his daughter." "His daughter?" Robert's voice rose dangerously. "His daughter? Where was he when you had pneumonia at age 6? Where was he when you needed help with homework or rides to soccer practice? Or someone to teach you how to drive? Where was he when you cried about kids bullying you at school? Or when you got your heart broken for the first time?" Each question was delivered like a physical blow, designed to diminish Tom's claim to any relationship with me, but instead of making me grateful for Robert's presence in my life, his words only highlighted the fundamental difference between showing up and actually connecting. "You were there," I acknowledged, my voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside me. "You were physically present for all of those things, but being there and being supportive are not the same thing." Robert's face darkened with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that when I cried about bullies, you told me to stop being so sensitive instead of helping me figure out how to handle the situation. When I got excited about good grades, you acted like I was showing off instead of celebrating my achievement. When I wanted to talk about college, you made me feel guilty for having ambitions beyond what you thought I deserved." The living room fell silent, except for the sound of my mother's quiet cry. Tom and Elena remained perfectly still, understanding that this was a conversation that needed to happen between Robert and me, regardless of how painful it became. "I spent my entire childhood trying to earn your approval," I continued, the words pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. "I changed my interest to match what you valued. I downplayed my intelligence to avoid making you uncomfortable. I convinced myself that wanting more than Cedar Falls had to offer was a character flaw instead of a natural human desire for growth." Robert's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. "We gave you everything we had." "You gave me material support," I corrected. "Food, shelter, clothing, basic necessities, and I'm grateful for that. But you never gave me emotional support. You never made me feel like the person I was becoming was someone worth celebrating." "That's not true," my mother interjected, her voice thick with tears. "We were proud of you. We just didn't know how to show it in ways you could understand." I turned to her, feeling the weight of 23 years of unspoken truths, finally demanding to be acknowledged. "Mom, You let me believe that Robert's rejection was about my choices when you knew it was about secrets you'd both been keeping since I was a toddler. You watched me internalize his disappointment as my own failure when the real issue was that he'd never fully accepted me as his child. My mother's face crumpled, but I couldn't stop now. The floodgates had opened, and everything I'd been carrying needed to come out. Do you have any idea what it was like to grow up feeling like I was constantly disappointing the man I thought was my father, to believe that there was something fundamentally wrong with me because I couldn't earn his unconditional love, to spend years in therapy trying to understand why I felt like an outsider in my own family? Sarah, Tom said quietly, the first time he'd spoken since the confrontation began, you don't have to defend your right to know the truth about your own life. Robert whirled to face him, fury evident in every line of his body. Don't you dare tell her what she does or doesn't have to do. You gave up that right when you walked away 23 years ago. I didn't walk away, Tom replied, his voice calm but firm. I was asked to step aside so that Sarah could have stability. I honored that request because I thought it was what was best for her, but I never stopped caring about her well-being, and I never stopped hoping that someday I'd have the chance to know her. Hoping, Roberts, that's convenient. Hope doesn't change diapers or pay for doctor visits or stay up all night with a sick kid. You're right, Tom said simply. It doesn't, and I'll always regret not being there for those moments. But I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be present for whatever future Sarah wants to share with me. The stark contrast between their approaches hit me like a revelation. Robert was still fighting battles from 23 years ago, still trying to prove his worth by diminishing Tom's value. Tom was acknowledging his mistakes, while focusing on what was possible moving forward. One conversation felt like a courtroom where I was both evidence and judge. The other felt like an invitation to write a new story together. I want both of you to understand something, I said, my voice steady with a certainty I'd never felt before. I'm not choosing between family. I'm choosing to have relationships with people who support the person I'm becoming, rather than punishing me for not being the person they wanted me to be. I looked directly at Robert, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. You raised me, and I'm grateful for that. You provided for me when you didn't have any legal obligation to do so, and that matters. But your love always came with conditions, with expectations that I be someone other than who I naturally was. And when I couldn't meet those expectations, you withdrew your approval as punishment. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but I held up my hand to stop him. Tom has known me for 3 months, but in that time he's never once suggested that I should change to earn his acceptance. He's interested in my thoughts, my goals, my perspective on the world. He celebrates my achievements instead of feeling threatened by them. He asks questions because he wants to understand me, not because he's looking for evidence that I'm making wrong choices. The silence that followed felt eternal. My mother was crying openly now, her careful makeup smeared with tears. Robert looked like he'd been slapped, his face cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been recognition. So what are you saying? Robert asked finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard. I'm saying that I love you because you're the man who raised me, but I can't keep pretending that our relationship was healthy just because it was all I knew, I replied. I'm saying that I'm going to continue building a relationship with Tom, because it feels genuine and supportive in ways I've never experienced before, and I'm saying that if you want to be part of my life going forward, it has to be on terms that don't require me to apologize for becoming myself. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is what your fancy education taught you, to be ungrateful, to abandon the people who sacrificed for you. It taught me to recognize the difference between love and control, I said quietly. It taught me that healthy relationships support growth rather than demanding conformity, and it taught me that I don't have to accept emotional manipulation just because it comes from family. For a moment, I thought Robert might storm out, might deliver another ultimatum about choosing between him and Tom, but instead, something seemed to deflate in him. He looked around the living room, taking in the evidence of Tom's success, the warmth of the family home Elena had created, the obvious care that had gone into making me feel welcome. I don't know how to do this, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be okay with sharing you. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. For the first time in my life, I saw past his anger and control to the fear underneath it all. He was terrified of losing me, terrified that Tom's natural advantages, biological connection, financial resources, emotional intelligence, would make him irrelevant in my life. You don't have to share me, I said gently. There's not a finite amount of love or loyalty that has to be divided between you. I can care about both of you without it diminishing what either relationship means. My mother spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Sarah, I owe you an apology, several apologies. Actually, I should have told you the truth years ago. I should have stood up to Robert when he was being unfair to you, and I should have trusted you to handle the complexity of having two fathers instead of trying to protect everyone by keeping secrets. She turned to Tom, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm sorry for asking you to stay away. I thought I was doing what was best for Sarah, but I can see now that I was just making choices out of fear. Fear that she'd love you more than Robert. Fear that the truth would destroy our family. Fear that I'd lose control of a situation that was already beyond my control. Tom's response was characteristically gracious. We all made decisions based on the information we had at the time. What matters now is that Sarah knows the truth and can decide for herself what kind of relationships she wants to have with all of us. The conversation continued for another hour, but the energy had shifted from confrontation to negotiation. Robert struggled with the new reality, asking pointed questions about boundaries and expectations, clearly wrestling with his need to maintain some sense of authority in my life. My mother worked overtime to mediate, apologizing repeatedly for the secrets she'd kept while trying to rebuild trust with both me and Tom. But the most important change was in how I saw myself in relation to all of them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to manage other people's emotions or minimize my own needs to keep the peace. I spoke honestly about what I wanted and needed from each relationship, setting clear boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept going forward. When my parents finally left that evening, it was with a tentative agreement to try family counseling, to work on building healthier communication patterns, and to respect my autonomy in deciding how much contact I wanted with each of them. Robert's goodbye was stiff and formal, but he didn't issue any ultimatums or threats. My mother's hug lasted longer than usual, and she whispered another apology before getting in their car. After they drove away, I sat on Tom's deck watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely at peace. Elena brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me in comfortable silence for a while. That was incredibly brave, she said finally, standing up to them like that, speaking your truth even when it was difficult to hear. It didn't feel brave, I admitted. It felt like survival. Like if I didn't say those things now, I'd spend the rest of my life trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it freely. Tom joined us on the deck a few minutes later, carrying his own cup of coffee and the weight of everything that had just transpired. How are you feeling? He asked, settling into the chair beside mine. Relieved, I said, surprising myself with the honesty of that response. For the first time in my life, everyone knows the truth. Robert knows I'm not biologically his daughter, but I still consider him part of my life. You know that I'm not expecting you to make up for 23 years of absence, but I want you to be part of my future. My mother knows that keeping secrets caused more damage than telling the truth ever could have. We sat in comfortable silence, as the stars began to appear in the clear high desert sky. In the distance I could hear the sounds of Marcus practicing guitar in his room, Elena washing dishes in the kitchen, the normal rhythms of a family evening that I was now part of. 6 months later, I was finishing my first year of graduate school at Oregon State University in Corvallis, commuting from Bend twice a week for classes, and spending the other days working on research projects that combined my interest in family dynamics with practical applications in community mental health. The academic work challenged me in exactly the ways I'd hoped, but more importantly, I was approaching it from a place of emotional stability I'd never experienced before. My relationship with the Bradley family had continued to deepen and evolve. Marcus and I had developed the kind of sibling bond I'd always hoped for with Jake and Grace, built on mutual respect and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Elena had become a mentor figure, someone whose approach to marriage and parenting provided a model for healthy relationships I'd never seen before. Tom and I were still navigating the complex territory of building a father-daughter relationship as adults, but every conversation felt authentic and supportive in ways that left me hopeful about our future connection. The situation with my adoptive family remained more complicated but had improved significantly. Robert and I were attending monthly counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in blended family dynamics, slowly working through decades of miscommunication and unmet expectations. The process was difficult and sometimes painful, but for the first time we were having honest conversations about our relationship instead of operating from unspoken assumptions and resentment. My mother had thrown herself into family therapy with the determination of someone making up for lost time, finally ready to address the patterns of secrecy and conflict avoidance that had shaped our family dynamic for decades. Grace had been surprisingly supportive of my decision to build a relationship with Tom, even expressing interest in meeting him someday. Jake remained more distant, but our relationship was slowly improving as we found ways to connect that didn't require us to take sides in family conflict. Most importantly, I'd stopped trying to earn love through perfect behavior or constant achievement. The Bradley family's unconditional acceptance had shown me what healthy relationships could look like, while the ongoing work with the Mitchell family was teaching me how to maintain boundaries while still preserving connections that mattered to me. One evening in late spring, as I was sitting in my guest house preparing for final exams, I received a text from Robert that stopped me in my tracks. Saw an article about your research project in the university newsletter. Very proud of what you're accomplished. Looking forward to hearing about it at our next session. It was a small gesture, but it represented something I'd never thought possible. Acknowledgement and support from the man who'd raised me, offered freely rather than grudgingly. The journey from his graduation day declaration that I was dead, to him, to this moment of genuine pride had taken almost a year, countless difficult conversations, and a willingness from both of us to examine our own roles and the dysfunction that had defined our relationship. As I prepared to move forward with the next phase of my graduate program, I realized that the girl who'd been devastated by her father's rejection at graduation was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that her worth wasn't dependent on other people's ability to see it. The discovery of my biological father had given me more than just a new family connection. It had given me a framework for understanding what love and support could look like when they weren't contingent on conformity or performance. The path from that devastating graduation day to this moment of peace and possibility had been longer and more complex than I ever could have imagined. But every difficult conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every choice to prioritize authenticity over approval, had led me to a life where I was finally genuinely free to become whoever I was meant to be. Standing in my bathroom mirror that night, I looked at my reflection and saw someone I recognized, confident, clear-eyed, surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was. The woman looking back at me was no longer dead to anyone. She was vibrantly, authentically alive, and she belonged exactly where she was. 2 years after that life-changing confrontation, in Tom's living room, I found myself standing in the campus bookstore at Oregon State University, holding my completed master's thesis in my hands. The document represented more than just academic achievement. It was physical proof of a journey that had taken me from devastating family rejection to a life built on authenticity and genuine connection. My research on adaptive resilience in non-traditional family structures had grown directly from my own experiences, turning personal pain into scholarly contribution that might help other families navigate similar challenges. The defense had gone better than I'd dared to hope. My committee had been impressed not just with the rigor of my research, but with the practical applications I'd developed for family therapy interventions. Dr. Tricia Warren, my thesis advisor, had pulled me aside afterward to discuss opportunities for publishing portions of my work in peer-reviewed journals. The validation felt surreal after years of being told that my interest in understanding family dynamics was impractical or self-indulgent. But the moment that truly captured how far I'd traveled came when I walked out of the university building and saw both of my families waiting to celebrate with me. Tom and Elena stood near their truck, beaming with pride and holding a bouquet of sunflowers from Elena's garden. Marcus was there too, having driven down from his own college campus at University of Oregon to witness his sister's achievement. On the other side of the parking area, Robert and my mother waited by their car, looking slightly uncertain but genuinely present in a way that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. The sight of them coexisting in the same space without hostility or competition filled me with a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with academic credentials. These were people who had learned to share their love for me without demanding exclusivity, who had grown beyond their own limitations to support my dreams, even when they didn't fully understand them. Grace bounded toward me first, having driven up with our parents for the occasion. At 18, she'd developed into a confident young woman who spoke her mind with the kind of directness I'd never managed at her age. "I'm so proud of you," she said, wrapping me in a fierce hug. "And I can't wait to read your research." Mom said, "It's about families like ours, all complicated and messy but still full of love." Jake had surprised everyone by coming too, taking time off from his job at a local automotive shop to be present for my defense. Our relationship had remained the most complicated of all my family connections, but he'd made genuine efforts over the past year to understand my choices and support my goal. "Guess this means I can tell people my sister is a real doctor now," he said with a grin that reminded me of the brother I'd adored during childhood. My mother looked older than her 53 years, the stress of the past 2 years having left visible marks, but there was a lightness in her expression that hadn't been there before we'd started family therapy. "I brought your favorite cake," she said, gesturing toward a covered dish in their car, chocolate with raspberry filling, just like Grandma used to make for special occasions. The mention of my grandmother brought a bittersweet pang of missing her presence on this important day. But I'd learned to carry her memory as inspiration rather than loss, understanding that her final gift of revealing family secrets had ultimately set all of us free to build more honest relationships. Robert approached more slowly, his congratulations careful but sincere. "Your thesis advisor spoke highly of your work during the reception," he said, referring to the informal gathering that had followed my defense. "She said you have real potential for making a difference in how people understand family relationships." Coming from him, the acknowledgement meant everything. Robert's journey toward accepting my academic achievements had been slow and often painful, requiring him to examine his own assumptions about education, success, and what it meant to be supported. But the man standing before me was genuinely trying to celebrate my accomplishment rather than diminish it, and that transformation had been worth every difficult conversation we'd endured. Tom and Elena waited their turn with the patience that had characterized their approach to building our relationship from the beginning. When I finally reached them, Tom's hug was warm and encompassing, the kind of embrace that communicated pride without reservation. "I've been thinking about what to say to you today," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it keeps coming back to the same thing. I'm proud of who you've become, not just today but every day. I've had the privilege of knowing you." Elena's congratulations were accompanied by practical gifts, a beautiful leather portfolio for professional documents, and a care package of homemade granola and tea for the transition period ahead. "I know graduate school doesn't end with thesis defense," she said with a smile. "You still have job applications and interviews and all sorts of new challenges coming up." Marcus hung back until the adult congratulations were finished, then stepped forward with a gift that made me laugh and cry simultaneously. He'd created a custom photo album documenting my time in Bend, from my first tentative visit to family camping trips, to quiet evenings on the deck discussing everything from psychology research to environmental policy. The final page contained a letter he'd written, expressing his gratitude for having a sister who'd taught him about resilience, authenticity, and the courage to become yourself even when it disappointed other people. "You changed our family for the better," he'd written. "Before you came along, I thought families were just something you got stuck with. Watching you choose us and watching us learn to deserve that choice showed me that the best relationships are the ones where people actively decide to love and support each other every single day. As both families gathered around me in that parking lot, sharing stories and making plans for dinner celebrations, I felt the profound satisfaction of having created something new from the wreckage of old patterns. These people didn't all love each other, didn't all understand each other, didn't all agree about what family should look like, but they'd all learned to love me in ways that honored who I was rather than demanding that I become someone else. The evening celebration took place at a restaurant in Corvallis that could accommodate our larger group, with 2 tables pushed together and conversations flowing more easily than anyone would have predicted. Robert and Tom found common ground in their shared pride in my accomplishments, while my mother and Elena discovered mutual interests in gardening and community volunteer work. Grace and Marcus hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared experience of having an overachieving older sister and their plans for their own college careers. But the moment that crystallized the magnitude of change came when Robert raised his glass for a toast. "To Sarah," he said, his voice carrying none of the reluctance or resentment that had characterized his acknowledgments of my achievements in the past, "for teaching all of us that families don't have to be perfect to be loving, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is insist on becoming yourself even when the people around you aren't ready to see who that is." The toast was met with enthusiastic agreement from both sides of the table, and as I looked around at the faces of people who'd learned to celebrate my success rather than fear it, I felt the deep peace that comes from finally being seen and accepted for who you truly are. 3 months later, I was packing my belongings for another major transition, this time to Seattle, where I'd accepted a position with a family therapy practice that specialized in adoption and blended family issues. The job was everything I'd hoped for: challenging clinical work, opportunities for research, and the chance to help other families navigate the complex dynamics I'd experienced firsthand. The guest house in Bend had served its purpose as a bridge between my old life and new one, but it was time to establish my own independent home base. Tom and Elena had been supportive of my decision to move to Seattle, understanding that my career goals required opportunities that weren't available in Central Oregon. Marcus was excited about having a sister living in a city he could visit during college breaks, already making plans for weekend trips and summer internships in the Pacific Northwest. My relationship with the Mitchell family had evolved into something I never could have imagined during those dark months after graduation. Regular therapy sessions had given us tools for communicating more effectively, while time and distance had allowed old wounds to heal. Robert and I would never have the easy closeness that some fathers and daughters enjoyed, but we'd built something genuine and respectful that honored both our history and our growth. My mother had perhaps changed the most of anyone, embracing a level of emotional honesty that sometimes surprised all of us. She'd begun attending individual therapy in addition to our family sessions, working through decades of conflict avoidance and people-pleasing that had shaped her approach to relationship. The woman who'd kept life-altering secrets to preserve family harmony had transformed into someone who valued truth over peace, authenticity over comfort. Grace had decided to attend University of Washington in Seattle, partly because she wanted to be closer to me as she navigated her own transition to independence. Her choice to study social work reflected the influence of watching our family's journey toward healing, and I looked forward to being available as a mentor and supporter during her college years. Jake remained the most distant of my siblings, but even our relationship had found a new equilibrium based on mutual respect rather than shared understanding. He'd begun bringing his girlfriend to family gatherings, and I'd noticed that their dynamic was healthier than what any of us had modeled during our childhood. Whatever lessons he'd absorbed from watching our family's evolution were apparently serving him well in his own romantic relationship. The packing process itself became a meditation on transformation. Each item I wrapped and boxed represented a different phase of my journey toward authenticity. Books from my undergraduate years when I'd first begun questioning family dynamics. Research materials from graduate school that had helped me understand the academic framework for what I'd experienced personally. Photos and gifts from both the Bradley and Mitchell families that documented the slow process of building genuine connection. But the most meaningful item was a framed copy of the letter Tom had written to me when I was 16 but never sent, the one I'd discovered during my first visit to his home. He'd given me the original after our family confrontation, saying he wanted me to have evidence that someone had been thinking about me with love and pride even during the years when I'd felt most alone and misunderstood. The letter, written in his careful handwriting, captured the hopes and dreams he'd carried for a daughter he couldn't contact. He'd written about imagining my interests, wondering about my personality, hoping that wherever I was surrounded by people who appreciated my curiosity and supported my ambition. Reading it always reminded me that love could exist across distance and silence, that connection didn't require constant presence or perfect circumstances. Tom and Marcus helped me load the moving truck, their assistance both practical and symbolic. They were sending me off to the next chapter of my life with their full support and blessing, confident that our relationship was strong enough to withstand geographical distance. Alina had packed enough homemade food to last me through the first week in Seattle, along with a small potted plant from her garden that would remind me of the home I'd found in Bend. "This isn't goodbye," Tom said as we finished securing the last boxes in the truck. "This is just expansion. Our family is getting bigger, not smaller." His words perfectly captured how I felt about the move. I wasn't leaving the Bradley family behind. I was carrying their love and support with me into a new environment where I could apply everything they'd taught me about belonging and accept. My mother and Grace drove up from Cedar Falls to see me off, their presence another indicator of how much our family dynamic had shifted. 2 years earlier, my mother would have been threatened by my decision to move even farther from home. Now she was excited about my career opportunity and proud of the independence I'd developed. "I know we can't undo the years when we didn't support your dreams the way we should have," she said as we stood in Tom's driveway preparing for our final goodbye. "But I want you to know that everything you've accomplished, everything you've built, everything you've become, we see it now, and we're grateful to be part of your life even if we didn't earn that privilege." Her apology was sincere but no longer necessary. The work we'd done together in therapy had already addressed the past, and our current relationship was based on who we were becoming rather than who we'd been. I hugged her with genuine affection, grateful for her presence but no longer dependent on her approval for my sense of self-worth. Grace's goodbye was characteristically direct and emotionally honest. "Thank you for showing me that it's okay to want more than what you're given," she said. "Watching you fight for your right to become yourself gave me permission to think about what I want my life to look like instead of just accepting what other people expect from me." At 22, Grace was wise beyond her years, shaped by our family's journey in ways that would serve her well as she built her own adult relationship. She'd learned from both my mistakes and my successes, understanding the importance of setting boundaries while maintaining connections, of pursuing individual goals while honoring family relationships. As I finally drove away from Bend, my rearview mirror filled with the faces of people who'd learned to love me without trying to change me, I felt the profound satisfaction of having created a life that truly belonged to me. The road ahead led to new challenges and opportunities, but I was approaching them from a foundation of authentic relationships and hard-won self-knowledge. Seattle welcomed me with drizzle and possibility. My new apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood was small but bright, with windows that looked out over the city and Puget Sound beyond. The family therapy practice where I'd be working occupied a converted Victorian house in the University District, surrounded by coffee shops and bookstores that reminded me of my college years, but with the added confidence that came from professional expertise. Dr. Manda Chen, the practice director who'd hired me, had been impressed not just with my academic credentials, but with my personal experience navigating complex family dynamics. During my interview, she'd commented that the best family therapists were often people who'd done their own difficult work around relationship patterns and identity formation. "Families come to us when their traditional structures aren't working," she'd explained. "They need therapists who understand that there are many different ways to create loving, supportive connections, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is to redefine relationships, rather than simply trying to fix them." My first cases reinforced everything I'd learned about the courage required to pursue authenticity in the face of family resistance. I worked with adult children who'd been disowned for career choices their parents couldn't understand, with adoptees seeking to connect with biological families while preserving relationships with adoptive parents, with blended families struggling to create new traditions while honoring old loyalty. Each client's story resonated with aspects of my own journey, but I was careful to maintain professional boundaries while drawing on personal insights that could inform my therapeutic approach. The line between using your own experience as a resource and imposing your solutions on other people's problems was one I navigated with careful attention to supervision and ongoing professional development. 6 months into my Seattle practice, I received an unexpected phone call that brought my personal and professional worlds together in a way I never could have anticipated. Robert called to tell me that he and my mother were considering divorce after 26 years of marriage, and they wanted to know if I could recommend a therapist who specialized in helping couples make that decision thoughtfully rather than destructively. The conversation was surreal on multiple levels. Robert was voluntarily seeking therapeutic support, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He was also approaching me as a professional resource, rather than a daughter whose opinion he needed to approve or reject. Most significantly, he was acknowledging that some relationships couldn't be fixed, and that ending them might be the healthiest choice for everyone involved. Your mother and I have been doing a lot of talking since we started family therapy, he explained, his voice calmer than I'd ever heard it. We've realized that we've been trying to make a marriage work based on who we thought we should be rather than who we actually are. Linda wants things I can't give her, and I need things she's not comfortable providing. We're wondering if we can love each other better as friends than as spouses. The maturity in his assessment impressed me almost as much as his willingness to share it with me. This was the man who'd once declared me dead to him for choosing graduate school over family loyalty, now seeking my professional advice about reshaping his most important adult relationship. I provided several referrals for therapists who specialized in conscious uncoupling and collaborative divorce, emphasizing the importance of working with someone who could help them make decisions based on their authentic needs, rather than external expectations or fear of change. The conversation ended with Robert expressing genuine curiosity about my work and pride in my professional development, a complete reversal from the man who'd once viewed my career aspirations as personal attacks. That evening, I called Tom to share the unexpected development and process my complicated feelings about my parents' potential divorce. His response was characteristically thoughtful and supportive. Change is hard even when it's necessary, he said, but it sounds like they're approaching this from a place of growth rather than destruction. That's probably the best possible outcome given their history. We talked for nearly an hour about family transitions, second chances, and the courage required to rebuild relationships even when the original foundation proves inadequate. Tom's perspective was particularly valuable because he'd experienced his own relationship restructuring when he'd divorced Marcus's mother before meeting Elena, learning that ending one kind of connection could sometimes make space for healthier ones to develop. The thing about family, he concluded, is that it's not really about blood or law or tradition, it's about people choosing to show up for each other consistently, especially when that choice is difficult or inconvenient. What you've built with all of us, the Bradleys and the Mitchells, that's real family regardless of how the legal or biological relationships get defined. His words stayed with me as I continued establishing my new life in Seattle, building professional relationships with colleagues who appreciated my clinical skills, developing friendships with people who shared my interests and values, creating a daily routine that reflected my authentic priorities rather than other people's expectations. 1 year after moving to Seattle, I was invited to present my research on adaptive resilience at a national conference on family therapy. The presentation went better than I'd dared to hope, generating interest from other researchers and practitioners who wanted to collaborate on related projects. But the moment that truly captured how far I'd traveled came when I looked out at the audience and saw familiar faces in the crowd. Tom and Elena had flown to Denver for the conference, wanting to witness my professional presentation and celebrate this milestone with me. My mother was there too, having driven with Grace from Cedar Falls to surprise me. Even Marcus had coordinated his spring break to attend, bringing his girlfriend to meet the sister he'd described as his role model for pursuing authentic goals despite family pressure. The sight of them sitting together in the conference audience, united in their support for my professional achievement, brought tears to my eyes as I concluded my presentation. These were people who'd learned to see my success as something to celebrate rather than something that diminished their own worth or threatened their relationship with me. The post-conference celebration stretched late into the evening with both families sharing stories, comparing notes on their respective growth journeys, and making plans for future gatherings that would honor our complex but genuine connection. Robert wasn't there. He and my mother had finalized their divorce 6 months earlier, and were still navigating their new relationship as co-parents and friends, but his absence felt natural rather than painful. As I looked around the restaurant table at the faces of people who'd learned to love me without conditions or reservations, I felt the profound satisfaction of having created something beautiful from what had initially seemed like devastating loss. The girl who'd been declared dead by the man she'd thought was her father had become a woman surrounded by people who celebrated her life, supported her dreams, and valued her exactly as she was. The journey from that graduation day disaster to this moment of professional and personal fulfillment had been longer and more complex than I ever could have imagined. But every difficult conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every choice to prioritize authenticity over approval had led me to a life where I was finally genuinely free to become whoever I was meant to be. 3 years later, as I prepared to defend my doctoral dissertation on therapeutic interventions for family relationship reconstruction, I realized that my personal story had become more than just background experience that informed my professional work. It had become a template for helping other families navigate the complex process of building authentic connections that honored individual growth while maintaining loving bonds. My practice in Seattle had grown to include training other therapists, consulting with adoption agencies, and developing workshop curricula for families dealing with identity-related conflict. The work was deeply satisfying because it allowed me to transform personal pain into professional purpose, helping others avoid some of the years of confusion and hurt that had characterized my own journey toward family authenticity. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the way all my family relationships had continued to evolve and strengthen. Tom and I had developed the kind of father-daughter bond that felt both natural and chosen, built on mutual respect and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Elena had become a trusted advisor and friend, someone whose perspective on relationships and family dynamics enriched my understanding of what healthy partnerships could look like. Marcus was finishing his engineering degree and planning to move to Seattle after graduation, excited about the possibility of living near his sister and building an adult-sibling relationship that we'd both missed during childhood. My mother had remarried a man named David who appreciated her emotional honesty and encouraged her continued growth, creating a partnership that looked nothing like her marriage to Robert, but seemed infinitely more genuine and supportive. Grace had thrived in her social work program, and we'd developed the kind of sisterly bond I'd always hoped for: professional collaboration, combined with personal affection and mutual support. Robert had begun dating someone new, a woman who seemed to appreciate his practical skills and steady character, without needing him to be something he wasn't. Even Jake and I had found our way to a relationship that worked for both of us, built on respect for our differences rather than pressure to be closer than felt natural. His girlfriend had become his fiancée, and their relationship showed evidence of the healthier patterns he'd absorbed from watching our family's journey toward authenticity. Standing in my apartment in Seattle one evening, surrounded by evidence of the life I'd built, diplomas that represented hard-won achievement, photos that documented genuine family connection, books that reflected my continuing growth and learning, I felt the deep satisfaction of having created something meaningful from what had once seemed like insurmountable loss. The woman looking back at me from the bathroom mirror was confident, clear-eyed, and surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was. She belonged exactly where she was, doing work that mattered, loved by people who chose to see and celebrate her authentic self rather than demanding that she become someone else to earn their approval. The path from devastating family rejection to this moment of peace and possibility had taught me that sometimes the most painful experiences are actually invitations to create something better than what you've lost. Sometimes being declared dead to someone is actually the beginning of coming fully alive to yourself and the people who are capable of loving you without condition. My father had been wrong about many things, but he'd been accidentally right about one. I had become dead to the version of myself that tried to earn love through compliance and self-diminishment. That person was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that authentic relationships require the courage to be seen as you truly are, even when that seeing initially causes discomfort or conflict. As I prepared for sleep that night in my chosen city, surrounded by my chosen family, pursuing my chosen work, I felt the profound gratitude that comes from having learned the difference between belonging somewhere and fitting in. I belonged exactly where I was, not because I'd managed to squeeze myself into someone else's idea of who I should be, but because I'd found people who created space for me to become whoever I was meant to be. The journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, continued growth, deeper levels of understanding and connection to explore, but I was approaching that future from a foundation of authenticity and genuine love that could weather whatever storms might come. I was finally fully, authentically alive, and that life was exactly as beautiful and complex and meaningful as I'd always hoped it could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.